Morning, everyone, and welcome to the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies second lecture with Professor Paul Lips on Islam in the Middle East. This lecture is entitled A Divided World, Iran's Shiites Grappling with Consistency and Change. Over the next 45 minutes or so, Professor Lips will speak, followed by a question and answer period. If you have questions, please enter them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Thank you again for joining us, and I now welcome Professor Lips.
Hi, good morning to you and good afternoon from my side. Thank you very much for all the questions that I received, both the chats and the ongoing correspondence with some of you. I'd just like to make some general comments about what happened last week and what I'll be trying to do in the coming two sessions. Last week was really an attempt to look at Islam in the general sense, to kind of give a mainstream perspective. And what happens as a result of that is that I tried maybe to do too much in one session, but we're talking about a very, very complex phenomenon with approximately 1.7 billion people. So I was trying to find a kind of a mainstream, and just to give you some idea of the challenge that I found, one of the slides was in women. And that maybe took a few seconds. Well, I gave a course at Tel Aviv University for 25 years, where that particular course was consisted of 30 hours. So I can understand some of your questions kind of had somewhat expected me to go into more detail on many of the issues, and this was really the problem. Last week was really mainstream Islamic concepts, not really my point of view, but trying to look at it from a mainstream point of view. Just want to take one or two issues which were brought up in some of the wonderful chat questions and some of the correspondence. Firstly, I think one has to remember in just about every question that I received, I would really have to answer in a certain sense, well, it depends which part of the world you're talking about. And therefore, even in the Middle East, what we call MENA, Middle East and North Africa, there are many, many different perspectives. And therefore, when we go out further, out to Indonesia and places like that, you're going to have a massive different set of alternatives. Just to take two or three of the issues which came up, in no sense so I'm suggesting that the other questions were unimportant. I think what we have to recognize, and this will be the focus of what I'm trying to do today and next week, is to, when we move away from theology into politics, which I think is very important because I think theology left by itself gives an incorrect perspective. But as we go into politics and economics and the gender issues, we begin to see that as much as the theory of Islam, the Quran and Hadith and some of the later sources might be very, very theoretical and very humane, the reality of the world is very, very different. The last comment I'd like to say is that isn't only true with Islam. I think when you look at Christianity, you can look at, and I'll just take one small example, the concept to turn the other cheek. However, if one looks at the Crusader period at the very end of the 11th century and 12th century in the Middle East, it was anything but turn the other cheek. And as some people have pointed out, that is, Judaism is not a religion of a minority group, but takes on a political component as it does in Israel, then it becomes very different. So I think what we'll be seeing today and next week when we look at the Ottoman Empire and Turkey, we'll actually be delving much more into the problematics of Islam as it moves away from its purely theoretical, theological perspective. So we can start now with the slides, and thanks very much to you.
Let's just ask them if they can see. Okay. Let's just ask if they can see.
Okay, I hope everyone can see me. I think last time it worked out to be fine. So hopefully this will be the case. So as we see on the slide here, divided world, Iran's Shiites grappling with consistency and change. And I think this is very important in Islam. I think what we find with Islam all the time, just about wherever we look at it. And some people would say that's exactly the same with Judaism, is this tremendous tension of...
Professor, 1 second. Your share screen isn't up at the moment.
Oh,
I'm not able.
okay, I'm sorry. So we'll just deal with it. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
Let's
Just a minute or two now as we, okay, shared screen here. We'll go this way. Is that better?
There we go now. Now you can just make it full screen.
Okay, good. Is that fine? We're okay now, are we? Good.
Yeah, that's good now.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is just an attempt to show the grappling with consistency and change. And once again, I think it's true of all religions, an attempt to retain what religion was perceived as being right at the very beginning. And as we see time goes by and there's a tremendous amount of change, because religion is interacting. Religion isn't a sideshow, but rather very, very central in what's happening. So the focus is at the moment on the Shia. By the way, just in terms of terminology, it's been anglicized and many people speak about Shiites, which is the anglicized form, and one can always say Shia or Shiites, both of them is accepted. The crisis here is quite amazing. And in terms of what I would say has been the most important event of Islam, which is the break of the Sunnis, about 85% more or less of the world of Islam, and the Shiites, has been so great that some of the historians and theologians have actually suggested that we're talking about two religions, that the splits are sometimes so profound that it does seem it isn't just an internal conflict, but something much more profound. So where does the story start? And there's a very, very sort of essential moment when one begins to realize that the belief system which divides the Shi'is and the Sunnis is based on a short period of history. The fourth caliph is Ali. Ali has a great deal of prestige by firstly marrying Fatima, Muhammad's daughter, one of Muhammad's daughter, and also being a family relation. So he comes from a very high status position. Now, as far as the Shia are concerned, the whole of Islam is based on family connections. Very much like one can see the monarchy, various monarchies of Middle Age kingdoms in Europe, for example. Whereas the Sunnis believe it's based on talent. It's a kind of meritocracy that the first three caliphs were people who were talented, albeit they had close personal and in one or two cases even family relations, but it's based on a totally different level. The Shia perspective is unless one is a blood relation, one really can't speak about having any basic status. Now, there's an internal battle, which one, just to go through it, is almost excessive, but just to try and give a broader sense of how the Shias look at themselves and why the tension is so great. Ali, according to the Shia people, forms the dominant and the correct form of Islam. Their perspective, unlike how the Sunnis look at it, their perspective is that this is Islam. This is what it is all about. Now, the question that we find with the Shia is based on the concept of the Imam. Now, the Imam is divinely appointed. The Imam could not be, from their perspective, someone who is appointed by a decision, a collective decision, or even a decision of a leader. It's something much more powerful than that. And therefore, Ali is going to be the central figure, and we're going to see that Ali and his children become the central players of the Shia world, essentially until today. The crisis of succession is what we've been talking about. And there was an internal crisis, complex without real need to go into all of the details. But essentially, we have two perspectives being developed as soon as Ali becomes the Caliph. In a period of internal, almost tribal tension, although some people would call it theological tension, Ali is killed. He, by the way, and this begins to show something very problematic about Islam, he is not going to be the only caliph assassinated, but that's happened on two earlier occasions as well. Violence is already coming in, and violence and anger is very much part of the historical analysis of Islam from Ali onwards into the Umayyad period and into the Abbasid period, and some people can certainly say into the contemporary period with concepts like the organizations like ISIS or the Wahhabi Salafists of Saudi Arabia. Anyway, Ali had two sons, Hasan and Hussein, and Hasan, being the oldest one, is in charge, always from the older to the younger one, as we are aware of it. He lived a life, he's considered a very serious spiritual kind of person, but had many wives. We don't know the exact number. He, however, was poisoned by his wife. Once again, some very painful events that we're finding in the 7th century. After Hasan has been assassinated by his wife, Hussein comes into power. And Hussein is a very central person with the Shia. If you can give a chronology, it would be Ali and perhaps Fatima at the very top, and then Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, coming on the second level. There's a conflict. And Hussein, with a very small number of soldiers, is faced by the group which becomes essentially and is the Sunni group, and that is the Battle of Karbala. The Battle of Karbala, as we'll see, is a vital moment of Shia identification. This isn't history, by the way, and I think this is important for us to remember. This is an emotive moment that the Shia people feel at many stages of the year, but particularly on one particular occasion, after Hussein was buried, was killed in this very violent battle where the Shia were the minority. And once again, we'll be talking about minority and majority as an important issue within Islam. He is buried in a beautiful mosque in Cairo. The memory is the Ashura festival. And I must admit, teaching about Islam to various student groups, the Ashura festival is really one of the dramatic and sometimes very painful issues. I must be honest, I have chosen a slide here of the Ashura at its harshest. This is men, only men would be involved in this, hurting themselves. By the way, in some of the videos that we have or YouTubes that we have, we see even an additional element where it's not only cutting their bodies so their blood will run, but their heads as well. Very, very gory kind of pictures. But I must emphasize that this is not the Ashura festival in all parts of the Shia world. The Shia world is large. We'll come to that issue a little later. And in many parts of the Shia world, the Ashura festival is with men with shirts on, but hitting their backs with metal in many cases, and sometimes it's a whip, some occasions it's a stick. But the whole idea of the Ashura is profound, and that is pain. And the concept of pain, and words that I used last time as well, the pain and the deprivation of pride, the humiliation of which Ali felt and Hussein felt, becomes very, very powerful. And as we can see, there are all those different issues where on the period of the Ashura, there's humiliation, grief. I must tell you a little story. As an Israeli soldier in Lebanon during the first Lebanon war, we were in an area where the ASHURA festival is held. And many of the Israeli soldiers never studied anything about Islam and certainly wouldn't know what ASHURA was. So they were happy to be in the particular part of southern Lebanon that we were, until I told them a little about the festival, and then they realized we weren't in such a great area. Fortunately, we weren't as foreign soldiers in any way tied up with the actual festival. What is the essence, and how is the theology and the what we would call in other religions clergy, but in Islam one doesn't have that particular phenomenon. What do we understand about the Shia? Well, it is totally Imam oriented. It's the centrality of the Imam. And if we try to ask the question, which is seen in the slide, what's the difference between the Shia and Sunni? Well, you know, if you look at the minutiae of we call in Hebrew the pilpul, the minutiae of the differences, there are different realms of prayer and concepts like that. But essentially, what's interesting in terms of the tremendous tension between these two groups is that if one looks at the 5 principles, 3 of them are exactly the same, both sides. The unity of God is accepted by both. The missions of the prophets, and especially Muhammad, the last and greatest of the prophets, and also the idea of reward and punishment in the hereafter. Those are ideas which are accepted. So 3 of the 5 central principles that one can look at in terms of the Shia world are collective kind of ideas. But we can see at the bottom there's something which I think is absolutely vital in terms of understanding why many experts would say the Shia are not just a different sect, but something more than that, a different denomination or religion. By the way, many Muslims who I've spoken to about this are very angry when I would mention it, because they would say that is not as true. All religions have certain differences, one from the other. But this is obviously a discussion that will carry on for all time, I imagine. A broad poll carried out in 2012 indicates that 40% of the Sunnis in MENA, Middle East and North Africa, do not accept Shias as fellow Muslims. And I think this indicates a tremendous amount. And I mention it and emphasize this because I think this is totally relevant to what we will find in the Middle East today, when we'll be discussing in a few minutes' time some Iran in the more modern sense. We can certainly see that these early concepts are deeply embedded and follow us right through to the present time. What is the Shia uniqueness? Well, firstly, on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see all this very, very important heritage. Like royal families right around the world, people would often say, I can relate to either a caliph or one of the companions or some other very central person. Very, very interesting, by the way, when you look at Islamic sources, how often in discussing a theological concept, you will find what I think in Western academia one would be very surprised about. And that is sometimes you can have almost half an article written by a Islamic scholar where it would actually be showing the legitimacy of the idea based on this person told this person told this person, and relating very, very clearly to their status within Islam. It's just not another expert, but rather very much the centrality of the theological line. Where the Shia disagree from the Sunni is the first one is very much the imamism as divine justice. This is in a sense saying that if you look at divine justice, as far as the Shia are concerned, it's with them. They have it. That is what their theological essence is all about. It also has a very, very central components of the Imam. Now, who are the Imams? Well, firstly, when one normally uses the term Imam, One is talking about the imams, the central imams, the ayatollahs, who we'll talk about a little later, who are the central imams. However, it is somewhat confusing because the imam is also the prayer leader in a mosque. And if the central prayer leader of the mosque is not there, then anyone else who becomes the prayer leader is called an imam. So one has to one has to realize in all senses what particular kind of imam one is talking about. We will be talking about clearly the central imams, those people who have led the Shia in a hidden manner. And we'll come to this issue now. The Shias are essentially divided into three groups. Now that isn't quite correct, because if we look at the larger Shia picture, we'll see that there are a very significant number of break-off groups over the years. One group which I'm well aware of, the Druze. The Druze were formerly at a certain time in history the Shia, and they broke off. But the central Shia thread, if we want to use that expression, are basically divided into three groups. Now, what is the difference? Well, once again, there are certain differences of prayer fashion, prayer concepts, but that isn't the main issue. The main issue is who is the imam, and we are talking now about the hidden imam. The 12ers are the larger group. In most of the world of Shia, not in all countries, by the way. For example, in Yemen, you would find very little 12ers, but essentially the 12ers are. Now, what does the 12er mean? This picture, by the way, indicates what we can see. If you look at the blue arrow here, all of them have faces. So these are we know who these people are. These are the imams who were not the final, not the last word. These are the imams who, the faces that we see, who are anticipating the coming of the Messianic period, something in Judaism, what we would consider the Geula. And here we see with the blue arrow, we're talking about a faithless person. Who as far as the 12ers are concerned, who will be the person who will eventually bring the redemption to the world, not only to Islam, but to the wider world. Here it's going to be a boy who vanished in 874. And here the language, the closest we can get to it is, he is not dead, but is not yet present in this world. So once again, one has to see it within a particular theological kind of basis. The 12ers are waiting. And waiting in Islam is a long wait. It's very different. I've always marveled essentially at the different concept of time, how the Arab world, which I'm most connected to, how the Arab world looks at time very differently from the Western world. In the Western world, we have a defined time, a kind of an almost stage. The book closes at a particular moment, so to speak. In the world of, in the Muslim world, and this is certainly true of the Arab Muslim world, time is much broader. And there is a kind of a patience for things to happen, not expecting to happen too quickly. And in many respects, it doesn't matter if it isn't happening yet, but it will happen eventually. And I think that is very strongly held pretty much without the world of Islam. And this is this long waiting period, which will go on for as long as it has to be. The second largest group are the Zaidi group, where they believe in the fifth imam. The fifth imam will be the honest one, the one who will be the holy person. And this group in particular we find in Yemen with the Houthi group. You may be aware of the Houthi fighting in the civil war in Yemen against Saudi Arabia and other forces. That's where we find the Zaidi group in particular. And then a much smaller group are the Seveners, and they were not particularly important except for about a 200 period more or less in Egypt, the Fatimid Caliphate, and that is a sort of a side group. Now, let us try and understand their dilemma. And I put this slide in particular with some consideration, in a sense, to try and speak in the voice of those Shia or Sunni who are very concerned about this internal division. And this is a cute one. The mother says, I am Sunni. The father says, I am Shia. And the little girl says, I am Sushi. A kind of a lightening up of what is not a laughing matter in any kind of sense, but rather something of deep concern for the Shia in particular. The Shia pretty much around the world, and there are exceptions. For example, when we get to Iran, we'll see that's exception. There are also some exceptions in the Asian arena. But essentially, they have by and large been the poorest section of society, victims of discrimination and oppression. We have to go back here to Ali and more so to Hussein. This humiliation, the point that I use so often, the term that I'm convinced is a central concept if we want to really get into the essence of the world, this the sense of alienation, of discrimination. By the way, there are many very good cases when you can see that. We'll be looking at Bahrain in a moment, and certainly when we look at Lebanon, a multi-religious country torn between various factions, you can see one analyzes the Lebanese situation and sees that the Shiites are actually a large group. They're one of the largest groups, but have this historical sense of discrimination and oppression. As we saw in an earlier slide, there are those Sunni who don't believe that they are Muslims, and here the word heretics, very powerful word, comes up. An overview of the world of the Shia comes up on this chart. An interesting chart, and once again, there may be disagreements. Certain demographers looking at these figures will disagree here or there, but I think it gives a pretty much accepted perspective of what we see. The most important Shia center is clearly Iran. Iran, which we'll look at in more detail just now, somewhere in the region 90 to 95%. In Bahrain, a very different case. Although they're clearly the majority, they're the minority in terms of political power. In Iraq, something which was extremely important during the period of Saddam Hussein, the Shiites actually a majority group in numbers, but the Sunni north, living in Baghdad and around Baghdad, a little bit to the north as well, the Sunnis, although they were nowhere near as large as the Shiites, have the power. And in Lebanon, as I mentioned, they're a large group of 45 to 55%, and we can go through all the way to Qatar. There are certain Shia groups in other countries, but this pretty much covers the world of the Shia. Let's look at Iran. Iran, as we know, is the center. In the 16th century, they became part of the 12 Shia group, and they are particularly important not only by virtue of the fact of being between 90 to 95% of the country, although there might be disagreements on those figures. They're very central in terms of the theological component of the seminary of Qom, south of Tehran, very, very central body. And that is really we're going to see here the tension between two seminaries, two central seminaries, one in Iran and the other in Iraq. The tensions which come about are that, as we'll see in more detail, looking at some other case studies, there are essentially two schools of thought. One is that to be a Shia, until the Imam, the main Imam, the Messianic Imam will eventually arrive. What we're going to, they would believe is that you cannot take on political control, that it is even better to have a non-Muslim in control, as long as that non-Muslim is a humane person, rather than taking on political control. I've been very interested in this whole idea, and I can find only a very small and albeit marginal case in the situation in Israel with Judaism. To just take one particular incident, in 1948 with the Declaration of Independence, a very tough war was going on between November 1947 to January 1949. And in Mea Sharim, a certain section of the Haredim actually put up the white flag. They didn't want to fight because they believed, and that group still exists, although they're a minority of the full Haredi world, they suggested that the state of Israel could not exist until the coming of the Messiah. So you do have this particular idea, and I'm taking the Jewish case for obvious reasons. So al-Asharati, he was already moving out of a very local perspective, and he was bringing in the activist approach. There's the quiet approach and the active approach. And this becomes very, very relevant in Iran in 1978. The major change of Iranian history, 1978, with the demise of the Shahist regime and the arrival of Khomeini, brings into tension this whole idea of is to be a Shia, is it to sit on the sidelines of history, to be purely a theological group, or does it really involve oneself in very, very activist political activity as well? And that is really why Khomeini is so important. Ayatollah Khomeini, Ayatollah, by the way, there are different levels of the Ayatollah. Khomeini and AL-SISTANI in Iraq, they're the higher level, but there are many Ayatollahs who have high status. Here there was the idea that as a Shia, one could take on government positions. There was no contradiction, really real contradiction, between being a theological leader and a political leader. However, in Iran, they were aware that there are tensions on this kind of level. And so you have the supreme leader in Iran and you have the president. And that's some sort of subtle attempt, I think, but it doesn't really work, to allow the Ayatollahs to be perceived as just being theological leaders and place the burden of government onto the president. However, that division doesn't really work, because we know that as time goes by, from the death of Khomeini in 1989 and all the periods we've had afterwards, it hasn't really happened that the supreme leader, the theological leader, has had much more power than the political leader, than the president. In Iran, we have one other component. The Iranian Shia approach is not just about the running of Iran. It is a transnational concept. Here, what one might call an imperialism, and I think it is an imperialism. Imperialism is important. The Iranian Shia group, coming from the sense of discrimination and alienation, look at themselves as having, in some senses, a golden opportunity, an opportunity that one shouldn't give up. And that is to really become transnational. And that is why in the Middle East at the moment, and this is certainly happening from the early 80s as well, 40 years ago, the Shia move in a very different way from the Sunni. Now, during a very earlier period, many, many centuries ago, the Umayyads and the Abbasids were in the same situation. They were transnational. And then they moved into much more local kind of Sunni environments, with always some central components, obviously the Hajj in Mecca and things like that. But the Shia are going in a much more political direction. And I think it's, if one looks at it from a sociological point of view, it is the expression of the underdog feeling at long last, after centuries of oppression, that now things can be changed by unification across the world of Shia. But there have been some cases where that has very clearly been contradicted. And I think the best case study is the very, very violent war between Iran and Iraq between 1980 to 88. All wars are violent, there's no doubt about it. But this particular war reached a particularly high level of conflict. And the issue that came up there, and that's caused a tension within the world of the transnational approach of the Shia. The tension was as follows. You have a Shia person from Iran fighting a Shia person from Iraq, southwest Iraq. And therefore, this concept of building a transnational religion caught itself in this particular situation. However, it still hasn't been given up. And one of the issues that I think in trying to understand Middle East history, however, whichever perspective one looks at, is to recognize this three-pronged tension, which I mentioned very briefly last week, between the identity as a citizen, part of a nation, the identity of one's ethnicity, being an Arab or a Kurd or a Berber person, and then the identity as a religion, which in the case that we're talking about would be divided between Sunni and the Shia. Deep, deep issues which come up here. And once again, although it isn't always clear, the Shia once again are looking at themselves, very much aware of what happened in the Iranian-Iraqi situation, but clearly trying to move forward, albeit as a minority group, to reestablish themselves as a central player in the world of Islam. The different areas where one begins to see the transnational goals, which are working most effectively, is the slide states under the shadow of Iran. Very interesting. But you see, it isn't just the states under the shadow of Iran. That wouldn't be adequate, but it is really trying to find in the four states that are there, the Shia component as the political activists who would be working both from a political perspective in terms of nationhood identification, as well as on a theological level. The Iranian situation is divided, as I mentioned earlier, an alternative approach. Ayatollah Montazeri, and we can see how tough the internal battles are. If we take Iran as a particular case study, Ayatollah Montazeri had very high status. He was within the leadership group for a certain period of time. He was recognized as a very important person. However, he at a certain time deviated from being purely a theological reason. This is already still under the period of the Shahs. When Khomeini comes back into power, having been in Paris, he brings in Montazeri, because Montazeri has this tremendous amount of power. But Montazeri is worried about the activist approach. He is a human rights activist, talking about how he's seen in Iran, and very much against the behavior at the last period of the ruling Ayatollah Khomeini, where there was mass execution of political prisoners, which put him under house arrest. The dissident mullah, the dissident leader, is very, very clearly seen within the political environment of Iran. Now, just to move on to another area which is very important is Iraq. In Iraq, firstly, as a result of Saddam Hussein and earlier events in Iraqi history, the leaders encouraged tension between the Sunnis and the Shias. And what we have in Iraq is much harsher in many senses than in Iran, because in Iraq, particularly under the rule of Saddam Hussein, there was a major attempt to try and decimate the southern Shias, some terrible mechanisms were used, flooding marshes and things like that, using gas, which we know gas was used against the northern Kurds, but also against the southern Shia. So here in the case of Iraq, the conflict between the Sunni and the Shia is much greater, although the Shia are the majority. They are a majority in numbers, but a minority in political power in most cases. There have been certain periods in the past where their numbers, their demographic figures have become important, but they don't trust the government. But they also, by the way, have a theological center. Their theological center tends to be much more less aggressive than what we find in Iran. And in the city of Najaf, we have thousands of, many hundreds of thousands of Muslims going there each year. And it's also clearly tied up with financial gain as well. This is a picture of the KARBALA ASHURA festival, the Iraqi one, where mass, and here the importance of numbers. By the way, we know this with the Hajj to the Kaaba in Saudi Arabia. This belief of mass participation, very, very powerful. Maybe the Jewish comparison is the large number of Jewish people who used to go during the three festivals to the Western Wall, to the Temple Mount. So somewhat similar religions have very, very clearly mass events which are extremely powerful. In Iraq, you have AL-SISTANI. AL-SISTANI belongs to the theoretical quietist group. And what he's really trying to bring about, he's a very old man, has a tremendous status in the world, but here he's trying to remove Islam from the political position. For many reasons, he believes that this is dangerous, and he's trying to do whatever he can. In Iraq, he's very much opposed by al-SADR. Al-SADR is an activist, very powerful. He was active against the 2003 American invasion. He formed the People's Army, a very charismatic, powerful leader. He fought against ISIS, and he's very active until the present day in anti-government protests. Here you have a religious leader who is absolutely, from all perspectives, a political military leader at one and the same time. To look at just some of the smaller cases, Bahrain is the situation where the Shia are the overwhelming majority, every now and again involved in demonstrations against the government. The Sunni government is extremely tough on any Bahrain kind of protest of any kind. The particular demonstration that we've seen here is about Ali Salman, who was a central leader. He was exiled, he then came back, and when he came back in 2001, he went through severe torturing in the Bahrain prisons. Lebanon is an even better example, perhaps, because in Lebanon you have HASAN Nasrallah, once again very powerful, just quoting one of his many, many anti-Israeli quotes: Palestine from the river to the sea is the property of the Palestinian people. He is the arch example, perhaps, of a theological leader, a military leader, a political leader, running an extremely powerful organization, the Hezbollah, which in Lebanon at the moment, if any of you are following the tragic events in Lebanon, you know that what's happening there is moving away from a belief in the Hezbollah. We're getting a number of reports where people, Lebanese, in some cases even the Shias, are worried about the division which the Hezbollah group is bringing about. The future will tell us what's going to happen there. That brings us to the end of my session. You can see here, and you'll be getting a copy of the slides, just some of the, what I believe are the more important of the YouTube presentations. I've chosen some short ones. I will be, as I mentioned last time, happy to deal with any questions that you have. I will also be listening to Matthew giving me the the chat points that you have mentioned, but I'm always welcome to accept questions to my Gmail. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you. Thank you for the great lecture. So there's a few questions that have come in, and if anybody else has additional ones, please type them in now. The first one that I'm going to read is to clarify one of your points earlier on. What were the two pillars that the Sunni and Shia didn't have in common? Shia.
Okay, the commonalities are essentially very much tied up with Muhammad. Muhammad is the last and greatest of the prophets, which means the Shia are very, very careful not to demote Muhammad to be higher than Ali. And I think this is really one of the very, very central issues. So even within their hierarchy of the Imams, there is essentially an acceptance of the Quran and very, very much an emphasis on the role of Muhammad, the Hadith, the traditions, the commentaries, the earlier commentaries as being common. Where it differs and where it breaks is as time goes by. So if we want to put it in a slightly different sense, the first stage of Islam is accepted as a commonality. The division starts with Ali. That is really what it is. And as I say, there are many, many similar components which exist in the overall idea. Now, some people have actually said, you know, what is it? What's the big deal? The big deal is this Imam concept. The Imam is a sinless human being. The Imam is the ultimate authority. The Imam is so unbelievably central, very close, just a little bit after Muhammad, certainly under Allah, the Almighty, but such an unbelievably powerful feeling that only the Imam knows what Islam is all about. So the idea of the Shia, which you don't have with the Sunni, is that this, you can't relax. This is just an early stage of who we are as Muslims, and it's this waiting, the 12ers and the 7ers and the 5ers. These people are all waiting for what Islam will really be. Now, it's a strange concept because most of us would believe that everything is written, that as religions develop, they develop with a sense of knowledge. In the Shia world, you have certain knowledge. You have the Quran, you have Muhammad, but there's this tremendous gap. Now, I think it's hard for non-Muslims to really understand it, but it is the waiting for the fulfillment. It's kind of only half the story is there, and that brings about a tremendous pain. The Sunnis are living in a different environment. The Sunnis, albeit, are waiting for a messianic period, but basically they're working by a defined set of understandings, which they accept, whereas the Shia are in this other waiting period. I know I've sat with Islamic scholars, and I think what they told me is exactly what I've mentioned here, and I think we just have to accept the tremendous difference between what we understand from Judaism, where we respond to resources, defined sources, whereas the Shia are responding to an unknown, waiting, that 12ers with that young boy. That will be when the world really reaches its peak, at what it should be. The best I can do. Sorry, I can't hear.
Sorry, I was on mute there.
Okay, good. Okay.
On that note about the 12ers, there's a question about whether or not there was influence with Christianity, sounding like a Messiah, or maybe something with Elijah. Is there connections between Judaism and Christianity?
An excellent point. You know, I think one can't deny for a moment, and this is very much when one reads the Quran, even when it isn't said clearly, there is definitely the interflow of Judaism and Christianity. Now, I don't think it's always possible to say exactly, but I would say more or less in terms of the question, that my answer would be yes, that there really are certain commonalities which are so important. And just to refer to what I went into last week somewhat briefly, is to really suggest that Islam, maybe like all religions in one way or the other, is very pragmatic. Islam looked back at what had been, what had succeeded. Judaism was perceived to be fairly successful, not maybe in numbers, but certainly as a powerful theological underpinning. Christianity certainly became much more powerful. So I think there is very, very much the interflow. And by the way, you will find it, and I found it being in the United States, meeting Muslims in various kind of dialogue frameworks, who would say to me very, very clearly, we are all really the same. You know, we've gone somewhat in our different ways. You know, we really can get together and, you know, everything can be okay. And I think that particular perspective comes from what I've just mentioned, that their feeling is very much that this is, Islam is, with Muhammad being the last and greatest of the prophets, Islam is just the addition. It's J plus C, Judaism plus Christianity equals Islam, so to speak. And I think really that's what it's all about. And I think it's very, very true. Christianity and Judaism are clearly finding itself through the Quran. Whenever I read the Quran, I just come to see even more sentences which seem to be relevant. Sorry, that's a long answer.
Oh, thank you. There's a couple of questions here about some other countries. One is the Israeli Arab population, whether or not they're all Sunni, and there's a question about the Indonesian population.
Sorry, the first one was Israel, was it?
Yeah, Israel, the Israeli Arab population.
Israel is totally Sunni. Israel totally Sunni. You have a literally handful of Shia. By the way, Israeli Arabs, Israeli Muslims are hardly aware of the Shia. They've had almost no connection with them, and they don't really understand it. The people who are aware of it, of the what we call in Israel the minorities, are the Druze. The Druze are very much aware of the Shia because many centuries ago they came from the Shia, but otherwise not. And the other case study was, sorry?
Was Indonesia.
Indonesia is largely Sunni. I'm not an particular expert, but as far as I remember, it's once again small groups. You do have small Shia groups in just about all parts of the world. By the way, there's Shia groups in the United States as well, but they're always a minority.
There's a question here about the position of women in the two sects and the major differences that may exist in the different countries. Yeah,
the women issue is tremendous. Goes very much back to my 25 years of teaching this course. And there was a question on that last week as well, very important question. Women are related to in totally different ways in the various countries. And sometimes it's very surprising. I did receive a question, interesting question about honor killings. And I think that's one mechanism of understanding what's going on. You take the country of Jordan. Jordan is essentially a moderate country, a relatively orderly country. They've got internal problems. But if one looks at the legal system in Jordan, one finds that honor killings are totally early theological, by which I mean, you know, punishment for dishonoring the family. By the way, that's what honor killings are. Honor killings are not to punish the women, but to ensure that the family retains its purity. That's the shortened version. But essentially what one finds, even in a country like Jordan, is that a father or brother killing a daughter or sister would receive very, very minimal amount of punishment. So in terms of the places where as a Muslim woman, it's probably best to be, I imagine the best is Tunisia. Tunisia generally is a country where we've seen a great deal of modernization. The close interaction between France and Tunisia is certainly one of the reasons. And that would be one of the places really where one sees the women in the best kind of position. In Turkey, interestingly enough, it will be the topic for next week. In Turkey, I was amazed spending time in Istanbul to see how in certain parts of Istanbul, the women look very much as if they would be in many parts of the Western world. However, as you go further east, you see the women not only dressing much more what would be called modestly, but very much sort of subjugated. You would feel the different positions they have. So I think what one has to recognize, and here a sociological comment, not a theological one, generally speaking, I would say that in more modern cities, the women are freer. And as you move into more rural areas and less developed countries, the level of the women is going to be very, very different. You have right through Islamic history these moments where women's positions were getting better, as we see in Saudi Arabia. And then there's a retrogression. Somehow the tensions between the conservatives and the modernists, terminology which I haven't used, but I will be talking about this next week. The tension between the traditionalists and the modernists is very, very profound. And as in many parts of the world, the victims or the gainers of that particular battle are certainly the women. So that's a fascinating question, and thank you for it.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll have time for one more question here, and I see that there's a number that have come in, and if Professor Lips is open to it, we can email your questions directly to him.
I'm happy to deal with them. Yes.
Great. So here's one more question. Can you quote convert from Sunni to Shia, or vice versa? And if there's a mixed marriage, is the child one or the other?
It depends very much on the area, and that is very, very regional in its situation. In more open countries, like in Israel, there's a small group of the Shia, and they can intermarry with the Sunni, but it's a rare phenomenon. So that one slide I took where the little girl has "I am sushi" is a very, very exceptional kind of situation. Once again, in arguments, I'm being honest, arguments which I've had with Muslims, when I've once again emphasized the fact that there are deep tensions, they would say, oh yes, we can intermarry, but it's a rare phenomenon. And even if it does happen, it's often not socially accepted. And so therefore, you know, we know the world is divided between law and social behavior. And certainly in terms of social behavior, it's totally unaccepted in the vast majority of cases.
Thank you. And thanks for all your questions. And we'll pass the ones that we haven't gotten to along to Professor Lips. So thank you all for joining us. And thank you, Professor Lips, for another interesting and enlightening lecture. We look forward to continuing the summer series next Monday at 10 a.m. for our final lecture on Islam in the Middle East, where we will explore politics and sociology in the modern state of Turkey. Please remember to keep your eye on Haberman Institute website and emails for all of our new classes and programs. Thank you again, Professor Lips, and thank you all for joining us.
Good. Thank you very much.
See you next week.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.